Hey y'all, this is Kerry here, the RPG Fanatic. I made a post on Reddit, which is already my mistake. But I did it on the Elden Ring subreddit, explaining why Elden Ring Nightreign trailer is like the final proof that Elden Ring takes place in the same world of Dark Souls. It's like the final nail in the coffin. Before I get into the post that really breaks down how Elden Ring, the base game, already tells us that it takes place in the same world as Dark Souls, I want you to see the comments I got from people. Okay? The ridiculousness that you're dealing with in this online community of people that I don't even know if they play the game. Why are they posting here? Their pessimism, their stupidity, their refusal to just accept basic facts about the game's lore. That's right there in front of you. This honestly kind of reminds me when there was the leaks about the DLC that showed Radahn was the final boss, and everybody didn't want to believe it online. Everybody thought it was fake. Like, universally, it's not even a joke. Universally, people were saying, it's got to be fake. There's no way this is Radahn. It doesn't make any sense. And then they were super mad about it, and they downvoted the DLC on Steam. They didn't understand what the fuck is going on in the game. Because, for what, I don't know why. I couldn't even tell you. How do you play a Dark Souls game, which is what Elden Ring is, and not enjoy the story or pay attention to the story? It's all there in front of you. I digress. Look at some of these comments from people. I didn't read most of this, and I get that speculating about lore could be fun. Why are you commenting on something that you didn't read? It's ridiculous. He says the game is a relatively cheap spin-off about fighting bosses for the sake of fighting bosses, and they put in those cost-cutting measure as purely fan service. So this is the kind of nonsense that you're dealing with, right? This pessimistic attitude for people who are probably borderline retarded. Like, you didn't read my post, so how do you know? How can you comment with any kind of intelligence, you know? How do you know what the hell's going on? They say it's a cheap spin-off, and it's reusing bosses, but it's not random things, right? It's specific things that they're showing us in the trailer. They've got the nameless Cain, who is associated with Gwyn, a son who was supposed to link the fire and refused. The Duke's dear Freya, that giant spider boss, is associated with Seath the Scaleless, who also has part of Gwyn's soul. The Centipede Demon is also associated with the origin of the Chaos Flame. This is all Dark Souls. These are all specific things, okay? And it's all linking back. It's all linking back to Lord Souls. He thinks it's random because you don't pay attention to the lore. To the point they can't even read a short post. It'll take them like 5 minutes to read. Let's go down here. Let's go down further, all right? This guy says, I hope this is sarcastic. This guy accused me of being absolutely deranged schizophrenia posting. You know, it's nonsense. You're going to see it's nonsense very quickly once I post up here, right? The trailer literally has a Firekeeper from Dark Souls 3 narrating, and they think it's a coincidence. It's like, I don't know if it's just cope or if it's just stupidity. I'm going to go on with stupidity. I'm going to go with stupidity because how can you plainly see that they have put Dark Souls characters into an Elden Ring game and still suggest that Elden Ring is not Dark Souls 4? I don't know how you can do it. This guy says, Nightreign is a standalone spin-off, takes place completely separate from Elden Ring. They are absolutely including Dark Souls bosses in Nightreign. This has no implication of the lore of Elden Ring. They exist in two disparate, he says disparate settings, stories, timelines, whatever. Okay, well, it's wrong. The official website plainly states that it takes place in a universe parallel to the events of Elden Ring, okay? That's a very distinct phrase. It's not parallel universe, but a universe parallel to the events of Elden Ring, where we return to the Round Table Hold. A place that is in the game's story outside the boundaries of time. Okay? It says parallel to the events of Elden Ring, meaning the events which happened in Elden Ring happened in parallel to the events happening in Nightreign. So what's really important here to understand, because this guy doesn't get it, right? You can look through here and you can see that he doesn't get it. He argues it can't be the same world. If I go all the way down through his rabbit hole, he tries to claim in the Famitsu article, well, this is a different guy, but it might as well be the same person because they're both retarded. He says, Famitsu article, the Night Lord is pulling Dark Soul bosses from another world. Well, the problem with that is every Dark Souls game has you pulling in people from a, quote, another world. That's the in-game explanation for the summoning and invading mechanic. It literally says invade another world, okay? The whole premise of Dark Souls is that there exist multiple parallel worlds running simultaneously, experiencing the same events. That is the entire setting. That's what it is. So how is Nightreign any different? Because it's doing the same fucking thing that happens in Dark Souls. And by the way, these alternate universes are not completely unrelated worlds. It's very convoluted and it's complex, but it's really not hard to understand that when you invade another world in a Dark Souls game or in Elden Ring, you're invading the same fucking world, okay? So there's like shards of the same world because there's some weird time shenanigans going on, time-space distortion stuff going on because the first flame is trying to get somebody to reignite it. And it's pulling in people from different worlds and allowing other people to fight each other over who gets to ignite it, which is eerily similar to what happens in Elden Ring, where the Elden Ring, acting as the first flame, tries to do the same fucking thing. So this is all cues that the world of Elden Ring is actually the same world as Dark Souls. It's just taking place much further in the future after the events of Dark Souls 3, where the first flame went out. But the Firekeeper explains in one of the endings that a new flame will come. Well, the new flame is the fucking Elden Ring, okay? The exact mechanics of how exactly the first flame became replaced by the Elden Ring, I don't know. That seems to be something very well hidden inside the story, if it's explained at all. What I am sure about is a couple things. So let me talk about why. Why Nightreign proves Elden Ring is a Dark Souls game. Go down here on my post because I prefaced, maybe this is where I went wrong. I prefaced this by explaining to people because some people often tried to claim George R. R. Martin wrote Elden Ring, so therefore it can't be a Dark Souls game. But that's actually not what happened, okay? What actually happened, explained through interviews, is that Miyazaki took his notes for Dark Souls 4 and gave them to Martin. And Martin came back with a treatment, and Miyazaki improved it. That's the nuts and bolts. I explained in detail exactly what happened here. But the nuts and bolts is that Miyazaki wrote Dark Souls 4. Martin gave his own spin on it, and then Miyazaki built off of that. That's why Elden Ring plays so very differently than a typical Dark Souls game.
I know that you've recently been a part of developing a video game, and it seems to me like it's sort of a natural fit for a fantasy fiction writer to work on a video game. How is that, different from what we know you for working on?
Well, it actually is considerably different. I've played some video games. I'm not a big video gamer, but the game is called the Elden Ring, and it's a sequel to a video game that came out a few years ago called Dark Souls, and it came out of Japan.
But there's lots of stuff that shows us that's basically taking place after Dark Souls 3. Okay? Breakdown. So you got the Eclipse, which in the lore of Elden Ring is a super big deal. There's a little Castle Sol, devoted to the Eclipse. There's lots of Eclipse symbolism within the game. There's lots of hints that there was a major eclipse event which happened in the very distant past, which ended the reign of the Sun Realm, and another eclipse that was attempted by Mikola's people, which didn't succeed in achieving its goals. So, the reason why the Eclipse is such a big deal in Elden Ring is because it's a big deal in Dark Souls. The event was important for the lands between because an eclipse happened during the end of Dark Souls 3, which ended the reign of Gwyn's gods, the original pantheon. So even the distant Sun Realm on a different landmass across the ocean, i.e., the lands between, a kingdom created prior to the events of Dark Souls 3 by Guinevere and Flan, who are two gods mentioned all throughout the Dark Souls games. In particularly in Dark Souls 3, specifically mentioned to have left the lands and created a new kingdom and had more children. This is specifically mentioned throughout the Dark Souls series that these two gods left together and created children somewhere else, which we never see in a Dark Souls game. I believe very firmly that where they went to is the lands between, and they created the Sun Realm. That explains why the Sun Realm has all this imagery related to the sun and sunlight, as well as fire. Because Guinevere is the princess of sunlight, and Flan is the god of fire. Now, Sites of Grace. Anybody who's played Dark Souls game, very obviously the Sites of Grace, that little flickering light, is the exact same animation as humanity from Dark Souls. Why is that? Well, it's obviously because grace is humanity. It's just been transformed into another form. And that's also why there's millions of hollowed out humans running around everywhere who don't have grace. They can't see grace anymore. You encounter other tarnished who have lost grace and turned into a hollowed form. That's because hollows are still a thing in the universe. It's still there, okay? And Marika's Golden Order just replaced it. They interjected the mechanic. I mean, it's very obvious that the Elden Ring didn't exist during the events of Dark Souls games. But that doesn't mean that it couldn't have been created and done something which I think is basically probably combining the Lord Souls or the new Lord Souls and creating new rules for the world. But it still changed. I shouldn't say changed. Rather, the mechanics, such as the dark sign, such as humans hollowing, that was still a thing that could happen. So, as the power of Marika's Elden Ring and her grace fades, which is what we're experiencing in the events of Elden Ring, you've got all these hollowed humans running around. So, I think the first flame, which created the Dark Soul, the soul of death, the soul of fire, the soul of sunlight, I think that the first flame went out, but something happened to bring it back, and it transformed into the Elden Ring. And maybe that is what happened with the Divine Gate. I don't know. It's still kind of fuzzy on the details. But it seems to be that a lot of the mechanics of the Dark Souls series, such as hollowing, are still in play. It doesn't affect our character directly, because they can still see the guidance of grace. They still have grace. Okay, so they've still got humanity. But everybody else can't see that. They've lost the guidance of grace. That's the whole premise of the Chosen Tarnished, right? So we are the sole person who can still see the guidance of grace. Everybody else is turned into a fucking zombie. That's Dark Souls. Continuing on. You look at the lore of Elden Ring's sorcery, right? It's all about magic crystals, which is exactly what the sorcery in Dark Souls is about. And you got the astrologers, whose part of their lore involves these wide brim flat hats, like the Crystal Sages from Dark Souls 3, and Big Hat Logan, who their tradition descends from Dark Souls 1. Okay? It's because thousands of years after the events of Dark Souls 3, those traditions have continued. The sorcery in Elden Ring is building off of the sorcery in Dark Souls, because it's the same fucking world. So you got the demigods now. You got Renala, Nox Mesmer, the Godslayer apostles, Marika herself, they all have a common body type, which is this elongated, slender bodies, which is the same type as Gwyn's offspring and descendants from the Dark Souls games. Obviously, it's because the demigods of Elden Ring are descendants of Gwyn. The bloodline just heavily diluted over thousands of years, but these traits still in place. And it's super fucking obvious, right? They're demigods who have the same body type as in Dark Souls gods. It's because they're the same bloodline. Okay? Now let's look at the ancient dragons, their offspring. And you can tell there's something off about them. Like, even if you never play a Dark Souls game, you can tell something is wrong with some of the dragons in Elden Ring, right? It's super obvious in things like the Dragonkin soldiers and whatnot, right? Who are said to be, an effort to reconstruct dragons, to create new dragons. Well, this is obviously the research continued from Dark Souls 3 by the Crystal Sages, who became the Nox, right? They created Dragonkin soldiers in Elden Ring's world, landmass, and they probably also created the ancient dragons we encounter in the game as well, which are nearly perfect, except they use lightning and have this gold, this grace, infused into them, which is very different than dragons in the Dark Souls series. I think that the reason is because they perfected the research for creating new dragons, which was mentioned in Dark Souls 2 and shown off in Dark Souls 3. So now they have these imitations of the ancient dragons that are running around using lightning, which is associated with Gwyn. So associated with his Lord Soul. Okay? That explains it. Because real dragons don't use lightning. At least real dragons within the Dark Souls world. Okay? So they've reconstructed them. So now let's look at Melina the Kindling Maiden here, and what her story correlates to within the Dark Souls world. Okay? Melina, the Kindling Maiden, needs to gain access to what remains of the embers of a sacred god-associated flame to burn down the Erdtree. It's very similar to the first flame and what we as the Chosen Tarnished, or excuse me, the Chosen Undead, in previous games have to do. Okay? We also know Marika tasked the last fire giant to tend to this flame. If we understand that the game takes place in Dark Souls, that explains why Marika needed that flame to be tended to in the first place. It's because if that flame goes out completely, then her own power will fade as well, because it's tied together. Okay? And how do we know this? Because as the flame is going out when we get to that altar in the mountaintops of giants, right? The flame is barely going out, which is also correlated to the waning of the Elden Ring's power, the dying of the Erdtree. They're related in the same way as the Lord Souls and the first flame through the events of the Dark Souls games. It's the same mechanic in place. They're related. Okay? So I'd argue that the so-called Fell God's flame might actually be the new first flame. And Elden Ring the Elden Ring itself is a combination of the new Lord Souls that sprang from it. That makes the most amount of sense when you understand what's happening in the Dark Souls universe and how its world operates, the rules by it, right? For whatever reason, Marika was able to transform the Lord Souls into the Elden Ring. That's what's going on. That's why they needed to keep the Fell God's fire going, because that is basically the new first fire, or the first flame. Now, you also see tons of spirals and coils all over the damn world in Elden Ring. Well, that's the same thing in Dark Souls, because it's all referencing the first flame. Okay? It's all referencing the first flame. In fact, maybe the whole reason why the DLCs floating castle has all these goddamn spirals everywhere is because the whole thing was built in a specific effort to create a new first flame. And that actually makes sense when you look at the trailer for the DLC for Elden Ring. Okay? Because the world is dark around everywhere except for the Divine Gate, which seems to have a new flame coming from it. That's what's going on, I think. I think we're being shown how they created a new flame for the world and created new Lord Souls, which Marika took and shaped into the Elden Ring. They did a massive sacrifice and created that Divine Gate. Now, the Felgard altar also has some weird time-traveling shenanigans to it, which is very similar to what the Firelink Shrine does, by the way. So the Felgard altar of the giants in Elden Ring puts us to Farum Azula, which is experiencing just massive amounts of time distorting shenanigans. Okay? Very similar to what the Fire Shrine altar in Dark Souls 3 does, which also does time-related shenanigans to get someone to relight the flame. It's the whole premise of what's going on in Dark Souls 3. It's reviving people, pulling them out of time, so that Lord Souls can be taken to relight it. Okay? So we have all these similarities. They're not coincidences. They're intentional things that are meant to show us that the world of Elden Ring is the same world as Dark Souls, taking place much further in the future after the events of Dark Souls 3, where the first flame went out and then reignited. And the mechanics by how it reignited are related to how Marika became this one true god who created the Elden Ring. Okay? That's what's taking place. That's what the game's trying to tell us. Now, what confuses the shit out of a lot of people in the English-speaking world is this word Empyrean, which I have to talk about. I talk about in my post. And I know people like to downvote and poo-poo on people that complain about English localizations, but this is really important, okay? The word Empyrean, I've watched so many videos of people talking about the lore in Elden Ring. Whenever they start going on tangents about Empyrean, they're often La La Land. The word Empyrean is 100% made up by the English localizers hired by Bandai, and it makes American lore theorists go off in unintended directions. So you just scrub that term completely from your mind, because it's a major distraction from understanding what is actually going on in the world of Elden Ring. The actual term you should be paying attention to is Shinjin, which is the original Japanese. It means divine people. That means the descendants of Gwyn, okay? It's talking about the descendants of Gwyn from Dark Souls. That's why it's divine people. But it also has a double meaning, which is not uncommon in Japanese fiction to label a people or a tribe of some importance, or even a person, with a name that can have dual meanings. In this case, it can also be read as new people, because Shin can mean super, divine, or it can mean new. It has multiple meanings in Japanese. So, new people in the sense they're people that came from somewhere else, right? So, understanding that they're descendants of Gwyn, they're descendants of the Sunlight Princess and the Flame God. They came from somewhere else to the lands between. They came to the landmass that is the lands between from elsewhere in the Dark Souls world, which is, the setting, the part of the world of Dark Souls, which we're mostly preoccupied with, which is Lothric. We know from Dark Souls 2, there's other land masses in the world, because the whole premise of Dark Souls 2 is that the king of that setting went to another landmass, fought giants, and took their bodies back and used their souls to create new dragons. Okay? So we know there's other places that exist in the Dark Souls world, and the lands between is another one of these land masses. We know this, of course, because we know there's other places outside the lands between which we don't get to see, which is the Badlands, where the Tarnished were banished to, and of course the Land of Reeds, where all these samurai people are coming from. So we know that the lands between, there's other places across the sea. The lands between has been concealed from the rest of the world using the mist. which is related to the Elden Ring, related to Marika shenanigans. So this all makes sense if you put it all together. You take the elements that we know from the Dark Souls games and you combine it with what's going on in the Elden Ring. You can see very clearly that the demigods that we're dealing with, these so-called Empyreans, the Shinjin, they're just descendants of Gwyn, is what they are. And they have the same traits as a descendant of Gwyn, which is pale skin, elongated limbs, slender builds. You see that in all these characters, ranging from Marika herself to her children, Mesmer. You see it in Renala. Ranni's corpse has the traits. Okay, Nicola has the traits. Melania has it. The Nox have it. Even the Godskin apostles have these traits, who of course are children of the Glomide Queen, who is also a descendant of Gwyn. Okay, here's more proof. If you look at the Divine Bottle item from the original Dark Souls game, Dark Souls 1, it is the exact same item. It is literally the same item as the Blessing of Marika. It's the same item. Literally. Okay? This isn't a coincidence. It's not a throwback. This is Miyazaki and everybody else at FromSoft telling us that Marika is a daughter of the Sunlight Princess from Dark Souls. It's the same world. So all these gods in Elden Ring are the same gods, the same tribe of gods from the world of Dark Souls. Distant relatives, descendants of Gwyn. That's why they have those traits. Okay? So, there's a lot more I could elaborate on here. I could talk about how the game heavily shows that Marika, her backstory, started out as some kind of duality goddess with two forms, just like Nicola, one representing life, the other one death. Okay? Marika's other form being the Glomide Queen until she abandoned the other half, just as Nicola would do to Saint Trina in his own quest, to repeat her steps to create a new replacement Elden Ring using the Divine Gate. And that Melina is the disembodied spirit of Marika, who merged back with the Glomide Queen after Radagon kicked her out of the body and usurped the power of the Elden Ring for his own. This is all shown in the backstory for Elden Ring. All the lore and what we experience ourselves through the story shows that this is what's going on. But I'll have to put all this into a later video to break it down for people. Because, it's just like when people wouldn't accept Radon was going to be the final boss of the DLC. People don't want to accept these things that come out of seemingly nowhere to them because they're rushing through the game. They're just focused on the PvP and they're not paying attention to the story. So, I know it's been a long video, but it's really important. Okay? Elden Ring Nightreign, it's not random why a bunch of Dark Souls bosses are showing up. It's because it's the same fucking world, okay? And the same time shenanigans are going on, just as every other Dark Souls game, just as in Elden Ring. And you've got, for whatever reason, people are being pulled into this parallel universe where, I guess, if I had to guess, the setting has to take place either after the ending, the Reign of Stars ending with Randy becoming, I guess not, I'm really sure what she's become. She's become the God of Night, I guess. And the Chosen Tarnished becomes the King of Night, okay? Because she destroys the Elden Ring. You very clearly see she destroys the Elden Ring and ushers in an Age of Darkness again. So maybe the game is taking place during one of those scenarios. Alternatively, it's taking place after the events of the Shattering War in a scenario before our Chosen Tarnished had came, and Randy had somehow managed to get somebody to kill Radon so that she could trigger that ending without our assistance. Those are the two areas where the events of Nightreign could possibly occur. Okay? But either way, I'm pretty convinced that it's got to be Ranni, who is the god of this current world. Whoever the Night Lord is, is debatable. It's either who the Chosen Tarnished was during the Reign of Stars ending for Elden Ring, or it's somebody else who managed in a different alternate time warp, world, took Radahn down, or maybe even Melina or Melania succeeded and did defeat Radahn. The one thing that's weird, though, is that supposing that Ranni succeeded without the assistance of the Chosen Tarnished, then one would argue that Miquella, too, would have also succeeded in what he was doing in the Land of Shadows. So that's going to be interesting to see which scenario it is. It makes the most amount of sense if it's our Tarnished who defeated Miquella and allowed Ranni to become, the one true goddess of night. That makes the most amount of sense. If it's not, then Miquella would also be in play. Miquella and Radahn would also be in play as well. So, I guess we'll have to see when the game comes out. But what I can definitely say for sure is that Elden Ring Nightreign proves that Elden Ring is taking place in the same world as Dark Souls is. It's basically Dark Souls 4. And I don't know. This is a 30-minute long video explaining this stuff, but I hope that you're convinced by the end of this. Thanks for watching. I'll talk about some more stuff in a future video.